This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm your host, Josh Malm. Today we are honored to host Commander of the Canadian Army, Lieutenant General Michael Wright. Wright outlines Inflection Point 2025, the Canadian Army's most ambitious modernization plan in decades, the imperative for structural and technological change in the Army, the continued importance of land forces, the role of the defense industry as a partner in modernization, and the reconstitution of the Army's personnel. A quick note before we begin. This episode was recorded remotely, so the audio quality may differ slightly from our usual standard. Thank you for your understanding, and we hope you enjoy the conversation. This is the Expert Series. General Wright, it's such a privilege to have you on the program today. Thank you so much for accepting the CDA Institute's invitation. We have quite the agenda today. We want to talk a little bit about the impact of your command experience on ongoing structural reform in the Army, some of the drivers of the modernization effort, preparing for geopolitical tensions and threat deterrence, the recruitment retention challenges, among many other topics. So without further ado, could you start us off by maybe sharing a bit about your journey through the CAF and how those experiences you've had have shaped your vision for the future of the Canadian Army?
Yeah, first of all, Josh, thanks very much for the opportunity to be on the podcast. As I was saying to you before we pressed record, we have a great relationship with CDAI and really looking forward to continuing that relationship. The journey, I've just hit 35 years in uniform as of this past summer. And maybe I'll kind of break the journey into two. The first part of my career, I largely spent in the field army. So in Manitoba, in Alberta, but also in Quebec. So that gave me a lot of time, serving at the platoon, company, battalion, and brigade level. And that really, gave me a good grounding in our tactics, also in operations. I got to do two operational deployments, one in Bosnia and two in Bosnia, one in Afghanistan. But then kind of the second half of my career, I've spent the majority of it in the joint space and the majority here in Ottawa. So serving within, as I was saying to you before starting, the Chief of the Defense Staff's office, serving with our combined Canadian Joint Operations Command, and serving with the Canadian Forces Intelligence Command. And I think what that really helped me do was to understand where the Canadian Armed Forces and the Department of National Defense fits within the greater national security community. And certainly it gave me a good idea of what the Army needed to do to show our ability to be agile and scalable, to get better at communicating the value of land power, and to make sure that we're working as part of that greater Department of National Defense Canadian Armed Forces team, but really embedding in that national security community as well.
Now, you've commanded various levels and across different infantry regiments. How has that breadth of command experience shaped your understanding of some of the structural reforms needed in the Army today?
Yeah, great question. And you're right. I've had the fortune of serving with Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, Le Royal 22e Regiment, and the Royal Canadian Regiment. But what I can tell you is ultimately we're all Canadian. So there are some differences between the regiments, but frankly, within our regiments, within any of our brigades, there is sometimes differences. I'll use the example, the infantry battalion I commanded in Shiloh, whereas the other two battalions were in Edmonton. So there are some differences, and there might be some rivalries, but at the end of the day, we are the one Army team. And so it allowed me to really see what our strengths are across the various parts of the Army. It also allowed me to understand that right now we're asking a lot of our division commanders. Our division commanders, we have 4 divisions currently in the Canadian Army. And although we call them divisions, they are not doctrinal divisions, nor are they what our closest allies would consider to be divisions. And they're really responsible for anything from force generating our regular force and reserve force soldiers, training them, being responsible for the infrastructure and the environment and community outreach. So it really led me to consider how we could, as we modernize the Army, modernize the way that the Army has been structured. I think another key part is international experience, not only on operations, but also both in my last job and certainly in this job, talking to our closest allies and seeing the journeys that they've been on in terms of modernizing their own armies.
Well, General Wright, you've described current force structure modernization efforts as the largest transformation since the turn of the century. I'm wondering if you might be able to get into some of the core drivers compelling the Canadian Army to pursue a modernization effort of this magnitude. And as you reflect on that, perhaps you could get into some of the details of Inflection Point 2025 as well.
Okay, yeah, great question, Josh. And maybe just to uh, give a bit of a nuance as opposed to the biggest force structure modernization, is actually the biggest modernization writ large for the Canadian Army since the turn of the century. Makes sense because, the turn of the century was as we were just about to get into the counterinsurgency fight in Afghanistan. So really, first of all, it's looking at the deficiencies we have and we've had for a number of years across people, equipment, training, and sustainment within the Canadian Army. People, and I think we'll have an opportunity to talk about it a little bit later, but we're certainly focused on not only getting the right number of people into uniform, but bringing the right people and giving them the right skills to serve in the Army that we need for the future. For equipment, one way or the other, we were going to have to do a pretty wholesale modernization of the equipment in the Canadian Army. There's so many of our capabilities, as I mentioned, that we'd procured prior to the mission in Afghanistan, and those capabilities served us very well during that mission. But really, we've switched from a focus on counterinsurgency. And when I say we've switched, this was actually over 10 years ago. It's been over 10 years since we've been in Afghanistan. But it's really making sure that we are prepared not only to defend Canada, but to be part of, if necessary, major combat operations anywhere around the world. So it's not only modernizing things like our M777 towed howitzer to actually having self-propelled howitzers that have the necessary firepower and survivability on the modern battlefield, but it's also making sure that we're introducing new capabilities that, frankly, some of them didn't exist or certainly have evolved significantly over the past decade or even the past few years, but also that we're digitizing. So when I say, the scope of the modernization of capabilities, there's actually 50 major capital projects we have ongoing in the Army right now. And then just going back to your question, we are absolutely modernizing the way that the Army is structured.
What would you say are maybe some of the core projects involved in this modernization? And for an audience that maybe is learning about these issues or hearing about them for the first time, what do you think are some important facts that they need to be aware of when it comes to modernization?
Yeah, I think the important fact is, I said that as I was coming into the job in the summer of 2024, I did, as any good Army officer would do, an estimate. And the problem statement I came up with was the Army that we have is not the Army that we need. So it's about the people, it's about the capabilities, and it's about the structure. Just for some of the capabilities, I mentioned that we have 50 major capital projects, but there's really 5 that I'm focused on to bring us up to where we need to be as a modern Army. The first one is a long-range precision strike. That's a capability that Canada has either arguably never had, or we certainly haven't had since the days of the Cold War. And that's a project that we're hoping to see rapidly accelerate over the course of the next few months. We're bringing back ground-based air defense. 20 years ago, Canada was one of the best nations in NATO in terms of air defense. It was a capability that we divested. We've reintroduced ground-based air defense systems into Latvia, and we're going to be introducing those same systems, both for very short range and for short range, into the Canadian Army. There's domestic Arctic mobility enhancement, which is making sure that we have vehicles that can be mobile and survivable as we operate in the Arctic, which is only going to become more important in the future. And then there's indirect fire modernization, which goes back to what I was saying, not only ensuring that we're replacing our current towed howitzers with self-propelled howitzers, but also reinvigorating the mortar capability within our infantry battalions. But probably I always say 4+1 for the priorities. The plus one is potentially the most difficult one. It's the integrated command and control systems and structures that will allow us to take all those capabilities I mentioned, the few dozen others that I won't have the time to mention, and ensure that we can integrate them across the Army, across the joint Canadian Armed Forces, but also when we're working internationally with our allies.
General Wright, I'm wondering if we might be able to zoom out a little bit further for the next few minutes, and maybe you could discuss the international security environment, what's changed in the past few years, and how that's impacting or influencing modernization efforts. I know we talked a little bit about that right at the beginning, but maybe you could dive a little bit deeper.
Yeah, so I think maybe I'll break it down into three. The first is the rules-based international order is under threat, if not already in the process of falling apart. And this rules-based international order that came about in the years following the Second World War is frankly what allowed Canada to become the prosperous nation that it is today. So we're already seeing that with the actions of Russia and China, and certainly the increasing cooperation of countries like Russia and China with Iran and North Korea. And so, as we've seen within Canada, it's certainly causing us to look at the alliances that we're a part of and determining what we need to do to better contribute to not only those alliances, but making sure that we're able to be strong and to defend Canada. I think the second one I'd say is climate change. Not only from a global perspective where we can look at climate change to determine where we might see some of the next geopolitical hotspots around the world. But frankly, it has a biggest impact here in Canada in terms of the weather-related emergencies. We're seeing over the past 10 years, there's been a marked increase in the number of weather-related emergencies at the Canadian Armed Forces. All parts of the Canadian Armed Forces, but predominantly the Canadian Army, are being called upon to assist federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments. And in the Arctic, which, again, as I said, is a huge focus of our current Our North Strong and Free defense policy, it's changing the way that we need to be able to be prepared to operate in the Arctic in the future, because the climate is changing in the Arctic. So anything from the equipment we have to the infrastructure that we're going to operate out of, to the skills that our soldiers need to be able to survive, but also fight in that climate. I think the third one is the concerns about emerging and disruptive technology and our ability to, first of all, keep pace with the innovation and the rapid iterations that we're seeing in technology, but then also knowing that some of those countries that I mentioned, like Russia and China, will not be bound to the same ethics and norms as we are in Canada and with our allies.
Thank you for that, General Wright. I'm wondering if we can just follow up on that quickly as well. You mentioned disruptive technology and emerging technologies. I'm wondering if you might be able to reflect on some of these technologies and which ones have you most concerned, and then maybe also reflect on our current capacity to meet some of those emerging threats.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the ones that I will mention, I think, are less emerging and probably have emerged. So certainly artificial intelligence is a huge topic of conversation, not only within the Army, across the Canadian Armed Forces and the Department of National Defense, but as we're operating with our allies as well. And there's a lot of processes that we have within the Army that can absolutely be enabled and allow us to do things quicker and more efficiently when we start introducing artificial intelligence. So, the targeting process is a good example. This is things that we're observing on the battlefield in Ukraine, where a targeting process that would have taken hours, the better part of a day in the era of the Afghanistan mission, frankly, with the introduction of artificial intelligence, can now happen in a matter of minutes. Not only can artificial intelligence help with some operational examples like targeting, frankly, we don't have enough human resource administrators in the Army, and even the administrative tasks that we're actually asking our section commanders and section 2ICs to do. A lot of that we should be able to rely on technology and rely on artificial intelligence. So they're actually focused on training their soldiers, not on doing administrative tasks. Maybe a second one, and this is probably something we could dive into a little bit more if you want to, because it's one of the key concerns I have is looking at drone technology. In effect, not drone technology, but uncrewed systems writ large, whether in the air, on the ground, or in the sea, and understanding what lessons we can be and should be learning from the war in Ukraine and other conflicts around the world, and determining how we can introduce that, first of all, into the training of the Canadian Army, but then ultimately procuring the right type of uncrewed systems for our soldiers.
Thanks once again, General Wright. I was going to save this question for last, but you kind of touched on it earlier, so I would like to bring it up now, and that is, you've commanded forces in both combat zones and domestic crisis responses. How do you see the Army balancing its expeditionary and domestic roles going forward?
Hey, great question, Josh. We're always going to have to balance those. Ultimately, the mission of the Canadian Armed Forces is to defend Canada. But we can defend Canada from Canada, and we can defend Canada from around, as we're deployed around the world as well. So we talked a little bit about the restructure we're doing within the Army before. We are moving away from those 4 current regional administrative divisions to a division that is responsible for national domestic operations, a division that is responsible for maneuver, so largely sending the forces that we need for operations outside of Canada, a division that's going to be focused on the support to the Army writ large across Canada, and then a division that's focused on training, not only the individual training we need to put our soldiers through, but also the collective training that we need to do so they have the sets and reps before they're ultimately employed on operations.
Thank you once again for that, General Wright. I'm wondering if you also might be able to reflect on the current recruitment and retention crisis in the CAF and how the modernization plan maybe aims to address some of the gaps there, or closing in on tackling some of the challenges inherent within that.
Yeah, good question. And so I will talk about modernization, but I'll also talk how the Canadian Army fits into the overall Canadian Armed Forces plan to increase our ability to attract, recruit, train, and ultimately retain soldiers. I think you know that when General Jenny Carignan came in as our Chief of the Defense Staff in July 2024, immediately she said her number one priority was to put a focus on recruiting and getting as many new members of the Canadian Armed Forces as possible into our basic training across the CAF. We've actually had some success in that over the past year. For the first time in over 10 years, the Canadian Armed Forces met what we call our strategic intake plan. In fact, we surpassed it for the number of new CAF members we were looking for last year. That's been facilitated by a few things. Certainly one is it's always good to have the boss, the Chief of the Defense Staff, saying, hey, this is my number one priority, and then putting the resources towards it. But it's also anything from changing the sequencing of things like the aptitude test, changing when you need to have your full medical exam complete, when your security clearance needs to be complete, and also ensuring that any of those areas that I mentioned are not meeting what's required, or if the soldiers we're getting are not meeting the values and ethics that we are that we demand, we need to demand, that we're actually able to release them during a probationary period before they reach what we call operational functional point. So from the Canadian Army perspective, we support the regular force recruiting and training that's done centrally. But I am responsible with the Army team for the recruiting and the training of our reserve forces. Right now, we have just under 20,000 members of the Army Reserve spread in 120 communities across the country. We're trying to grow. Our aiming point is 24,000. And frankly, I would like to not stop when we hit that aiming point, but go well beyond there.
General Wright, for much of the last 2 decades, I think it could be argued that the Canadian Army has been viewed kind of through the lenses of counterinsurgency, peacekeeping, and perhaps domestic crisis response. Has the Canadian Army ever lost the ability to fight wars abroad? And what new capabilities does it require to fight and prevail against peer adversaries?
Wow, that is a good question, Josh. First of all, I'll go back to, I think about, do we have the capability to fight wars abroad? This is why I'm so focused on the soldiers we need to bring in, the capabilities that we need to arm them with, and making sure we have the right structures for wherever those operations, wherever we might need to be ready for major combat operations. So it goes back to, the importance of not only making sure we're bringing in the projects that I mentioned, but that we're introducing drones, that we're learning lessons from Ukraine about the importance of electronic warfare, about air defense, but also, frankly, reinforcing the lesson that mass matters. I think one of the reasons why we haven't seen a breakthrough from either side in the war in Ukraine is they haven't been able to have the right balance of precision and mass. So this is why we need to seize upon the opportunity that we have right now to rapidly accelerate the modernization of the Canadian Army. So we're getting the right capability that would make a difference for any type of operation, but specifically would make a difference in war fighting. So to make sure that not only can we be agile, scalable, but we're also able to be lethal if required. I'm just going to go back to what you said about has the Canadian Army ever, I think was how you said it, lost the ability to fight a war. It's really interesting. I'd say last month I was out in Vancouver and I was doing a community outreach event at the armories of the Seaforth Islanders. And the room that I was doing it in was a room that's dedicated to the Battle of the Medak Pocket, which happened in September of 1993. Those soldiers who were from 2nd Battalion of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry in Winnipeg, but frankly were drawn from reserve units as well all across the country. They went over on a peacekeeping mission and they found themselves in the largest firefight since the war in Korea. And so the Canadian soldiers in 1993 did what they did in 1951 or 1944 or 1914. They adapted to the training that they had. And this is where I will say our training. But if you ask me, are we doing enough training? I don't think I would ever say we're doing enough, but the training that we do offer is excellent. And so the training that we provide, and this is why I need to put the focus on making sure that we have enough soldiers and they're being armed with the right capabilities. So if they are put into a situation, whether it's on the eastern flank of NATO in the Baltics, whether it's here in Canada or whether it's anywhere else around the world, that they are able to fight and to win.
I was wondering if you might be able to reflect on how recent operational experiences, be they perhaps in Eastern Europe, the Arctic, or maybe even domestic environments, have contributed to the urgency to modernize? And if yes, how so?
Yeah, a fantastic question. So certainly the urgency we're seeing, I've mentioned a few of the areas that we're watching the battlefield closely in Ukraine, observing the lessons. But then we always say that until you've actually made a change, it can't really be considered a lesson learned. So making sure that we're seeing what's happening there in terms of drones, in terms of electronic warfare, in terms of the fact that, it is very difficult to not be seen on the battlefield. So just as we're talking about new technologies, we're also talking about making sure we're still skilled in things that we were actually quite skilled on 30 years ago, camouflage, concealment, and deception. it also goes to when we look at what our multinational brigade, Canadian-led multinational brigade in Latvia needs to be prepared for. It's why a lot of the capabilities I spoke about are ones that we are procuring, yes, initially for the mission in Latvia, but then we need to procure for the Canadian Army. So as I said, the ground-based air defense, we already have a system over there that's going to be a new short-range system that's going to be coming over shortly. We're also will be introducing loitering munitions, even some handheld thermal imagers. Just we're using Latvia as an opportunity to accelerate modernization of the Canadian Army, but we're also using it hand in hand with the Canadian Joint Operations Command as a battle lab to test not only the equipment that we need, but the tactics, techniques, and procedures that we need to use moving forward. You also asked about the Arctic, though. So, as I mentioned earlier, that the environment in the Arctic now, harsh, unforgiving. It will remain harsh and unforgiving in the future, but there will be changes in the equipment that we need to be able to be mobile, survivable, and also to fight. There's a lot of experimentation that's being done right now, actually, by our Canadian Rangers. So Canadian Rangers, 5,000 Canadians who are spread across the country. And it is not only in the Arctic and the North, but specifically in the Arctic and the North. They're experimenting with drones up there. They're experimenting with what are the right types of equipment they need for mobility and survivability, so that as we start doing more training and operating in the North and the Arctic, that we're able to send soldiers from the South, from both the regular force and reserve side, to operate and thrive in the Arctic.
I'd like to get specific for a moment, General Wright, and I know this is a topic that our audience will be very interested in learning a bit more about. From your perspective and vantage point, what sort of added capabilities are needed in Latvia right now? And what sort of capabilities does the Army need to train at home to meet the Latvia commitment?
We had the introduction of the ground-based air defense system. We just fielded an anti-tank system. We now have a counter uncrewed aerial system capability that's dismounted. We're also going to be putting that onto a vehicle. We have the light tactical vehicles that have been fielded there first. They're actually made just a couple hours down the road along the 401 in Oshawa by GM Defense. We've got some brigade command and control and communications that we've also introduced to determine as we move forward for the next generation of command, control, and communications in the Canadian Army. What do we need? To answer your question of what of that list do we need in the Army, the answer is all of the above and more, because we cannot afford to just procure capabilities for Latvia. We need those same capabilities back here. So first of all, our soldiers who we're sending over to Latvia have the ability to train on them and gain a proficiency, but also a confidence in the equipment before they actually deploy over to Latvia. Because I think it's important for everyone to realize that, there's been a few occasions where I've heard Latvia referred to as a training mission. It is absolutely not a training mission. Don't get me wrong. Our soldiers go over there and they experience some exceptional training, but it is a mission where we are part of the deterrence and collective defense of NATO's eastern flank.
General Wright, thank you. We're almost at about time here. I want to ask you one more question to kind of help bookend this discussion before I hand it off to you one more time, maybe for some final thoughts. But just as I said, to bookend the conversation we've just had, I'd like you to kind of think back to the start of this podcast, and I'll ask again, General, what is the Army we have? What's the Army we need? And how can we go about getting there? And maybe within that, what's your vision for the Canadian Army, 5 to 10 years from now?
Yeah, so the Army we have is doing an incredible job of not only being able to operate in Canada, but operate in Latvia, train Ukrainian armed forces at locations in Europe. And they're doing that with deficiencies in people, in equipment, in training, and sustainment. The Army we need is an Army that has the people, the equipment, the training, and the sustainment. How we're getting there you mentioned at the beginning, we didn't really have time to talk about it, but we are just releasing a internal Army strategy called Inflection Point 2025. And it's really the call to action that we cannot ignore the problem any longer. Modernization is something that needs to happen. Modernization of our people, of our capabilities, and of our structures. Where does that lead us? That leads us to making sure that the Canadian Army is interoperable, relevant, digitally transformed, and capable of providing the government of Canada, because it's ultimately the government of Canada who decides where and when its armed forces and the Canadian Army will be employed. We need to give them agile, scalable options to defend Canada here or anywhere around the world.
General Wright, thank you so much for your time today. Before we wrap up this discussion, I'm wondering if you would like to share any final thoughts you have, or if you think there's a really important part of this conversation that we didn't get to that you think deserves some attention. I know we've only been speaking for half an hour and could probably have a much longer discussion, but if there's anything close to your heart or you think is important for our audience to know, I will hand the mic back off to you for some closing remarks.
Yeah, Josh, maybe I'll close off by, at the beginning, I thank you for this opportunity. I am trying to go and talk to as many Canadians as possible about the importance of the Canadian Army, which is a vital national institution. So I can certainly do that through podcasts like this, but it's important for me to meet with members of government. It's important for me to meet with industry, academia, Canadians across the country. And this is where I really rely on the one Army team that we have that's in all 10 provinces, all 3 territories. And why next week, as we gather in Ottawa for what we call Army Week, I'm going to be talking to certainly the senior leadership, the colonels, the general officers, the chief warrant officers, but also our network of honorary colonels and lieutenant colonels across the Canadian Army, because it is really powerful for me to be able to work with them to help communicate the message of the Army and the importance of land power to Canadians.
Thank you so much, General Wright. We here at the CDA Institute really appreciate you and everything you do for our national security and for your efforts modernizing the Canadian Army. I just want to say our audience is comprised of practitioners, currently serving CAF members, retirees, academics, policy wonks. We have and a general audience. We have a wide community, and I just know that your appearance on this program is going to be a real treat for them, and I know our audience is going to be really excited to hear this program when it's out. So your appearance on the podcast has really, I think, helped elevate it, and I hope we can work together to help spread this important message to Canadians about CAF modernization efforts and also the importance of having a well-equipped Army. So thank you so much, sir, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come speak with us today.
Hey, Josh, thank you for the opportunity. And again, thank you for the great support that the CDAI gives to the Canadian Army, the Canadian Armed Forces, but then the important work they do to make sure that we're having discussions about national security across Canadian society.
And that's all for today's episode. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email Josh at cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.